She had spent 712 days collecting the dead world's leavings before anything alive came looking for her. Not that she counted anymore. She'd stopped counting around day 400 when the counting started to feel like a countdown towards something she didn't want to name. After that, she just worked. She woke, she ran the circuit, she salvaged, she sorted, she built. She slept. She woke again. The days were long on Kepler's third, 17 Earth-standard hours of light, 7 of darkness that never got fully dark because the debris fields in the upper atmosphere scattered the moonlight into something diffuse and permanent, a sky that glowed like the inside of a seashell even at the darkest hour. She'd stopped thinking of it as alien after the first year. It was just the sky, her sky. Her name was Mara Voss. She had been a field technician for the Colonial Survey Authority, 4th grade, specializing in environmental sensor calibration. She had been 28 years old when she went underground into the surveyor's cache beneath the remote post at grid reference 44 Echo 7. She didn't know exactly how old she was now. Older. Her hair had grown past her shoulders for the first time since she was a child, and she kept it bound with a strip of cable insulation, because that was what she had. She was the only human being on the planet. She was possibly the only human being in this entire system. She tried not to think about that with any frequency. The Volkai had taken the human colonies the way a tide takes a sandcastle, not with fury exactly, but with a patient and total inevitability that was somehow worse than fury. 3 waves across 6 years. The first wave came in ships that looked like the shells of enormous deep-sea creatures, bioorganic and wet-looking in the gold light of the system's star, and they burned the industrial centers first. Precise. Economical. No waste. The second wave came 9 months later and burned the population corridors, the transit hubs, the residential districts, the medical centers that served 17,000 people at capacity. The third wave never needed to burn anything. There wasn't much left to burn. Mara had survived because she'd been assigned to the wrong post at the right time, or the right post at the wrong time, depending on how you tallied those things. Grid reference 44 Echo 7 was a remote survey station at the edge of the third continent's geological survey zone. 3 colleagues, a signal dish, a scanner array, and roughly 42 square kilometers of flat red rock and ancient debris between her and anything that would have constituted a military target. The dish and the array were destroyed in the first wave. The post structure took a secondary blast and became uninhabitable. Her 3 colleagues, Dari, Okonkwo, and a man named Ruiz who'd been with the Survey Authority for 18 years and still laughed at all of his own jokes, were killed in the second wave. Mara had gone underground, into the cache beneath the post, which had been built to survive exactly this kind of event, because the Survey Authority had been building caches on colony worlds for 70 years, and had long since accepted that colony worlds had a way of becoming catastrophically hostile on short notice. She'd taken the emergency rations, the medical kit, the 2 sets of work clothes, and a VHS tape that Ruiz had kept in his desk. Some ancient musical he'd found in a collector's estate on Earth and thought was funny to carry across 40 light years. She'd taken it because it was the last thing that had his fingerprints on it, literally, and she wasn't ready to leave that behind. She'd waited 312 days before she accepted that no rescue was coming. After that, she worked. The salvage flats stretched for 11 kilometers in every direction from the ruins of the post. Not just debris from the colony, this world had its own geological history, and humanity had only been here for 12 years, and whatever had been here before humanity had also left things behind. She found artifacts she couldn't identify, components she could half recognize, materials she'd never encountered in any technical training. She cataloged everything. She built shelves from metal scrap and labeled them in Sharpie marker. She'd found 6 of them in a sealed supply box in the Eastern Relay Station ruins, the greatest single find of her first 6 months, more precious to her than the power cells she'd spent 3 weeks hunting. She organized the shelves by material type, then reorganized them by potential function, then reorganized them again by the system she eventually settled on. What I understand, what I partially understand, what I don't understand yet. The last shelf was always the fullest. She considered this a measure of how much she still had to learn, which she considered a resource rather than a failure. She built tools from the debris. A pry bar first, then a wire stripper, then a multi-tool that was nothing like anything she'd been trained on, but that she could use with both hands in the dark after 2 months of practice. She built a water reclamation system that was inefficient by engineering standards, but effective enough to keep her alive. She built a power relay from components she'd salvaged from 3 separate systems, and spent 11 days getting it to stop sparking before it finally ran clean. She repaired her work clothes so many times that the original fabric was almost entirely replaced by patches of different materials, and the result looked like something you'd wear if you were designing clothes for people who had never seen clothes before but had been given a description. She built things that weren't tools. After the first year, she started building things she could only call art, because she had no better word for what they were. Arrangements of salvaged components that pleased her eye in ways she couldn't fully articulate. A mobile made of cracked optical lenses that caught the afternoon light and threw it around the interior of her shelter in shifting patterns. A wind chime made of hollow metal rods she'd cut to lengths that produced specific tones when they struck each other, tuned by ear over 3 weeks of patient adjustment, until the chord they made in a strong wind was something close to a major third. And the sculpture, the one she'd built over the better part of 6 months, revisiting it, adding to it, taking pieces away, a structure made from interlocking gear housings and bearing assemblies from a dozen different machine systems, balanced so precisely on a central pivot that the wind off the flat could turn it all day without it falling. It had no purpose. She couldn't have explained why she'd spent so much time on it. Something in her had needed to make it, and so she had. She had no one to show any of it to. The cockroach colony in the old supply room had survived the bombardment. She let them be. They were clearly descended from whatever breeding population had come over on the original colony ships, adapted to the environment but still recognizably terrestrial, which made them something. She didn't name them. She wasn't going to name cockroaches. But she didn't disturb them either, and sometimes in the evenings she sat in the doorway of the supply room and watched them do their cockroach work, and there was something in the steady purposefulness of them that she found genuinely settling. In the evenings she watched the VHS tape on a player she'd rebuilt 3 times. The tape itself was degrading. There was static now across the top third of the image that hadn't been there in the first year, and she watched it less often now to slow the deterioration. But she still watched it. It was a musical from centuries ago, a thing of color and improbable costumes and people singing about love in language so heightened it had looped back around to something honest. There was a scene near the end, a simple scene, 2 characters standing close enough to touch, and one of them held the other's hand, just held it, and the song they sang said that it only takes a moment, and the moment, held in memory, lasts a lifetime. She'd watched that scene probably 400 times. She still cried at it sometimes. She'd stopped being embarrassed about that after the first year. She was alone. She was allowed to cry at musicals. On the 712th day, a ship came. She saw it from 4 kilometers out, moving across the early morning flat in long sweeping arcs, a drone, but nothing in any human manufacturing database she'd ever accessed. Sleek. White or something very close to white, the color of glacier ice at depth, the kind of white that has blue in it. Shaped like something between a weapon and a hand. It moved with an intelligence that was clearly directed from somewhere, too purposeful for full autonomy, too precise for simple programming. It was scanning. She could see the light-emitting array on its forward end, cycling through spectrums she didn't have words for. She watched it from behind a debris pile for 47 minutes. It swept the flat in a grid pattern, methodical and unhurried. Then it went back over ground it had already covered and swept it again with a different emission pattern. She stayed hidden. It found her on the third sweep, because she'd been careless. She'd left too much of her morning routine intact, the same path at the same time, and the third sweep was specifically calibrated to pick up biological heat signatures, and she was the only warm thing on 42 square kilometers of dead rock. It was hovering at the edge of the relay station ruins when she stepped out from behind the eastern wall. They saw each other from roughly 80 meters. The drone was a bit taller than her when it hovered, maybe a bit taller than her, with the weapon port under its nose roughly the size of her fist. She had no illusions about what that port could do. She'd seen what these systems could do. She'd been underground for 312 days because of what these systems could do. She stood still. It scanned her. She felt it, a low vibration behind her molars, more sensation than sound, the kind of feeling that is almost not a feeling at all. She raised her hand. Not in surrender, not with the flat palm of the universal human signal for stop, which she suspected would be received as exactly that, and she didn't want to start a conversation with the word stop. Just a wave. The kind you give a stranger across a parking lot. The kind you give a neighbor you've never met but who you've seen enough to acknowledge. A small human hello. The drone tilted at her. It had no head in any anatomical sense, but the forward section of its chassis dipped in a way that read as curiosity, so clearly she felt it in her chest. Hello, she said. It made a sound, not language or not language she'd ever encountered, a tonal production, ascending at the end, the kind of shape that in any language she knew meant question. She'd heard Volkai language before during the waves, but never close, never meant for her, never anything she'd been able to parse as communication rather than noise. This was different. This was an invitation. She pointed to herself, Myra. It said the word back. Or tried to. The consonants were rendered through whatever system it used for sound production and they came out wrong, the M too hard, the R too far back in a register that wasn't quite a throat. But the shape of it was there. Mara, 2 syllables, the right stress. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. Mara, she said again. It did something that she could only describe as mirroring. Some part of its forward chassis moved in a way that corresponded to her gesture with an exactness that seemed deliberate. Then it made a longer sound, more complex, more tonal, with what might have been subharmonic layers she was hearing less with her ears than with the vibration in her chest. She spent the next 3 days writing phonetic approximations of that sound in her notebook before she settled on something her human tongue could actually produce. Whale. 2 syllables. It wasn't right, it was probably nowhere close to right, but when she said it, the drone oriented toward her with a promptness that suggested it recognized the attempt, and that was enough to build on. Whale. The drone came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By the end of the first week, it was on the flat when she started the morning circuit, hovering at the edge of things, watching her work with what she could only describe as patient interest. She started explaining her work to it out loud, the salvage, the sorting, the components and what she was doing with them. Because she'd been narrating her days in her own head for 700 days, and the shift to narrating them aloud was almost nothing, and the difference in how it felt was enormous. Whale couldn't understand English. She was certain of that. But it watched her hands when she worked with an attention that felt genuine, and it made sounds when she did something that was apparently interesting, and it went still, entirely, utterly still, its scan array completely quiet, when she made the mistake she eventually decided had changed everything. She was showing it the sculpture, the gear housing structure on its central pivot, turning slowly in the afternoon wind. She explained what she'd built and why, knowing the explanation was for herself as much as for the drone hovering beside her. She talked about the balance, the way the asymmetry of the arms was actually more stable than symmetry would have been because of how the weight distributed through the turn. She talked about finding the gear housings in different systems, and recognizing that they could fit together in a way that wasn't what they were designed for, but that worked anyway. That worked better, actually. Whale went still. Its scan array went quiet. The faint hum of its drive system dropped to something below her hearing threshold. It hovered in front of the sculpture and was as close to motionless as a hovering machine can be, and it made the sound she would write in her notebook that evening and label. This is what it sounds like when Whale is moved. She didn't know that yet. She would learn. The ship came down in the 6th week. A city block's worth of glacier-white bioorganic hull settling into the flat with less noise than she'd expected. The landing gear deploying from its underside with a precision that suggested it had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. The same aesthetic as Whale, the same color, the same faint bioluminescent pulsing along the hull seams that she'd come to recognize as a Vaukai design signature, though this was nothing like the weapons platforms that had come through during the waves. This was something else. Survey class, maybe. Research. She didn't have the vocabulary yet to know the difference, but she could feel it in the way the ship moved, in the economy of it, the absence of aggression in its positioning. She stood beside the sculpture and waited. The ramp descended from its underbelly, the color of old bone, and they came down in a column of 8. She had seen Vaukai before, through long-range optics during the second wave, watching them move through the ruins of the transit corridor with the unhurried certainty of a species that knows the enemy is already finished. She'd studied everything she could find about them in the survey database before the array went down, and that information was fragmentary, was gathered mostly from long-range observation and inference, was wrong in ways she would only discover over time. But she'd had no other preparation, and it had been all she had, and she'd studied it until it was memorized. None of it had prepared her for the scale of being close. They were tall 2.5 meters, the shortest of the 8, and the tallest was a full head above that. 4 limbs, but not bilaterally symmetric in the way mammalian evolution tends to produce. The left side was slightly heavier, more muscled, the dominant side, the side from which some distant ancestor had reached first toward the world. Their skin, or the thing that served as skin, was a dense iridescent chitin that caught the light differently at every angle, and that shifted color with something she couldn't name yet, deep indigo at the edges of the column's posture, amber at the center of several of their chests, a flat gray-white in the eyes of the 2 at the column's rear. Their faces were wide and angular, with sensory clusters where a mammal would have had ears, organs she couldn't look at directly without feeling that she was missing something, that they were perceiving depths of information in the air around her that she would never have access to. Their eyes were large, still, and the deep reddish-black of dried blood, and they did not blink in any rhythm she could recognize. The one at the head of the column was different from the others. Larger, for one, not just taller but somehow denser, the gravity around him subtly increased, the way a very large fire changes the air in a room just by existing. The chitin along his left arm was darker than the rest. A scorched-looking depth that she would learn over time was the Vaukai marking of combat history, of accumulated consequence, of a life in which things had been decided by force, and the body carried the record. He moved the way things move when they have never had to hurry, not slow, not lazy, but with the specific deliberateness of a person for whom time is a resource that has never run short. Whale was at her left shoulder. She noticed the drone drift slightly closer to her as the column stopped 6 meters from where she stood, a small adjustment she registered without yet understanding. The leader looked at her. It wasn't hostile. She'd braced for hostile, had spent 6 weeks telling herself she could hold her nerve when the ship finally came because the drone hadn't killed her, and whatever had sent the drone wasn't going to come here to kill one human technician in a ruin. She'd mostly believed it. She'd believed it enough. But the look wasn't hostile. It was something more complex and in some ways harder to hold, because it was the look you give something you've been told is extinct and have just found breathing in a field. Assessment without category. She was a data point outside the available frameworks. She said, "I'm going to assume you don't speak English." He said something to the others in a language that was more percussion than phoneme. All rhythm and resonance and harmonics she was already trying to catalog before she could stop herself. 2 of the 8 held position. The other 6 split and began moving through her work site, the salvage shelves, the tool bench, the reclamation system, the sleeping area. They moved through it with a careful thoroughness that was not vandalism and not quite respect but something in between. One of them picked up the gear housing sculpture. She stopped herself from saying, "Don't touch that." She stopped herself in the half-second before the words would have formed, held them in, and she did not know why exactly, except that instinct said the moment she demanded something she would define the terms of every interaction that followed, and she was not ready to do that, and she didn't know enough yet to do it well. The leader was still looking at her. She reached into the breast pocket of her jacket. She moved slowly, telegraphing every motion, because she had no way of knowing what their targeting reflexes were, and pulled out the notebook. Not the original, which she'd filled completely a year ago and kept sealed in a waterproof case. One of the later ones, number 6, which contained her phonetic work on Wales' tonal system. She held it up, open to a page. "I've been learning," she said. "Not enough to matter, probably, but I've been trying." He reached out and took the notebook. He was careful with it. She'd been expecting careless. He was twice her mass, and she represented a conquered species in the ruins of a world they'd burned. But he took the notebook the way you take something you recognize as having weight beyond its physical substance. 2 fingers on the spine, the pages opened with unhurried deliberateness. He looked at the pages for a long time, at her phonetic transcriptions, her diagrams of tonal patterns, her marginal notes in 3 colors of ink. His chitin shifted as he read. She watched it, that slow amber bloom across the upper chest and throat, the color moving the way weather moves across a landscape. He said a word to Whale. Whale said it back to her, adjusted for her hearing range. A question, the ascending shape of it. She said, "I don't understand enough yet, but I will." His chitin held the amber for a moment. Then he handed the notebook back. His name, the version of it that her human tongue could shape, after weeks of approximation, was Kareth. She learned later what she hadn't known then. She learned it in pieces from Whale, from the pair of crew members she came to think of as the scholars because they had the equipment of researchers rather than soldiers and the manner of people whose job is to notice things. From the linguistic database, Kareth eventually gave her access to without explanation, simply leaving the data chip on her worktable one morning and saying nothing about it. She assembled the story the way she assembled everything, from components, building upward, not assuming she understood until she could demonstrate it. What she learned was this. The Volcae ruled by bloodline in a way that made the feudal systems of human history look like casual suggestions. Lineage was not metaphor or tradition. It was law, biology, and the architecture of cosmic order, braided into a single inextricable thing. A mate who could not continue the line was not a personal misfortune. She was a violation of the covenant between a ruling house and the forces that had established that house's right to rule. This was not rhetoric. This was, in the Volcae understanding, literally true. Kareth had been bonded to his mate. She would come to know the name as Eveth, Eveth of the Second Scar, through the process his people used for such things. Assessment of suitability over months, negotiation between houses, the confirmation of chitin chemistry compatibility that their biology used to determine reproductive potential. By every measure the process could evaluate, Eveth had been perfect. The lineage behind her was 11 generations of warriors with an unbroken combat record. She was intelligent, capable, composed under pressure. She was everything the assessment said a mate for the apex of house should be. What the assessment could not determine in advance was whether she could bear young. She could not. The discovery had taken 3 years. The exile had followed. Not loudly, The Volkai at Kareth's level did not do things loudly. Evith was simply removed. Her name struck from the lineage records. The house closed around the wound the way a body closes around a cut, healing over it until the surface was smooth and there was no visible sign that anything had been lost. Kareth had ordered the exile. The law required it, and he was the law of his house, and he had been raised to the law the way she had been raised to the survey authorities' field protocols, with a thoroughness that left no space for the question of whether it was right. He had enforced the exile. And then, 8 months later, he had taken a small ship and a small crew and a commission for a survey of dead colony worlds on the edge of mapped space, and he had come here, and he had sent Whale across a salvage flat to scan for signs of biological survival, and Whale had found her. She sat with that for a long time, in the evenings, watching the optical lens mobile throw light around the walls of her shelter. She did not tell Kareth what she understood. She waited, and she learned more, and she kept that understanding the way she kept the things on the shelf labeled what I don't understand yet. Not because she was hiding it, but because she'd learned that you learn more from a thing when you don't let on how much of it you've already grasped. She'd learned that from the Volkai, in fact, from the scholars specifically, from watching the way they withheld knowledge as a negotiating instrument. She'd adopted the technique and felt no particular guilt about it. What she did let on, gradually, was the work. Kareth remained on the planet. The commission was his cover and his excuse, and possibly also genuinely interesting to him. She couldn't always read his intentions, and she'd stopped assuming she could. He spent his mornings going through the debris with the scholars, cataloging things she'd already cataloged, sometimes noting things she'd missed. He spent his afternoons moving through the survey zone she'd mapped in her first year, running their own instruments over ground she knew from 11 kilometers of daily circuits. In the evenings he was in the ship. Except when he was watching her work. She noticed it first in the 3rd week. She'd been building the upgraded water reclamation unit. She'd been accumulating the components for months and had reached the threshold of what she needed, and she laid it all out on the work table in the morning and started in. After maybe half an hour she became aware, without looking up, that someone was standing behind her. She kept working. She explained what she was doing in English, because the explanation steadied her hands and she'd long since stopped requiring an audience that could understand the words. She described the filtration housing, the condenser loop, the valve seals, and why the original setup had been losing about 12% efficiency at the junction point. She connected the components. She ran the preliminary diagnostic. And then at the coupling joint she made a mistake, the wrong thread gauge, wrong by a single increment, the kind of thing you only feel when you're really paying attention, and she caught it before she'd applied any pressure. She backed out, found the correct component on the shelf, installed it, moved on. He made a sound. She looked up. He was pointing to the coupling joint. Then he made a gesture she'd been cataloging for weeks, the lateral tilt of the Volkai head, the gesture that didn't mean what a human head tilt means but something more deliberate, a gesture of acknowledgement. She translated it provisionally as, yes, correct, confirmed. I know, she said, I caught it myself. The amber bloom across his chest was slow and total. She thought, I'm being assessed. I have been being assessed since the ship came down. The question is for what purpose? She went back to work. The scholars, she never learned to call them anything else. It had been her term from the start, and it stuck in the way that private nicknames stick when they turn out to be accurate. Spent most of their time in the survey zone's southern quadrant, where the geological record was apparently more interesting than the ruins, which she found both reasonable and faintly insulting. But 2 of them came to her worksite regularly in the afternoons. One she identified as a xenobiology specialist from the instruments he carried, and the way he examined the cockroaches in her supply room with an attention that bordered on reverence. The other was a linguist. She knew this because the linguist examined her notebook the same way she imagined she would have examined a primary source from a dead civilization, with careful hands and an expression, readable through the chitin shifts, that she could only call scholarly hunger. She started leaving notebooks out for the linguist, not accidentally, deliberately, the way you put food out for something wild that you want to bring closer. The linguist, whose name she eventually approximated as Dawkai, would sit cross-legged on the flat outside her worksite for hours, going through the notebooks, and would occasionally approach her workbench and ask, in the patient, careful way of someone who knows they're the only communicator in the room, a question she would spend 20 minutes parsing before she could answer. Dawkai's tonal grammar explanations were the backbone of her language acquisition. She repaid them with access to every notebook she'd kept, all 7 of them, and eventually with access to the reconstruction of what she'd been able to work out of Ruiz's battered Earth history drive before the crash. 3 centuries of linguistic evolution, available to a Dawkai linguist who had never imagined it existed. Dawkai, when she finally understood enough to ask how the exchange felt, said, "Like finding a shelf that has always been there, but that you did not know was yours to read from." She understood that. She'd built her whole life around that feeling. In the 4th month, she showed him the VHS tape. Not the player was too complicated to explain without the shared language she was still building, and she wasn't ready to watch the musical with him because she wasn't sure she could guarantee she wouldn't cry at the hand-holding scene, and she wasn't ready to explain that either. Just the cassette itself. She took it from the shelf and held it, and then she held it out to him. He took it, examined it. His sensory clusters moved in ways she'd started to learn, the anterior ones extending slightly, the gesture of focused attention. He turned the cassette over, looked at the label, the woman's face, the title in a font style that was centuries old, the production company's logo. He said something. She said, "I don't understand that word." He said it more slowly, breaking the tonal components apart. She said, "Still don't, sorry." And then, working from what she did have, "It's from my world from before all of this. It belongs to a man who died here." She paused. "I kept it because he'd touched it, because it had his hands on it, and that felt like something worth keeping." She paused again. "I don't know if that makes sense to you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he set the cassette down on the table with the same careful 2-fingered placement he'd used with the notebook. Not dismissal, placement, as though it belonged there. He said, "I understand preserving the things that have been touched." She'd understood all of it by then, but she didn't tell him that. She found the entry about Edith in the database in her 3rd month with access to it. She'd been working through the political section, the taxonomy of houses, the hierarchies, the formal records of house actions in the past decade, when she reached the subsection on the apex of houses lineage records and found the name redacted. Not missing, redacted. There was a procedural marker in the Dawkai record-keeping system that she'd come to understand as the equivalent of a strike-through, not deletion, because Dawkai records were permanent and inviolable, but a formal marking that said, "This name no longer counts. This name is as if it were never written." She read the entry around the redaction. Read the date of the procedural marker, 8 months before Whale had spotted her on the flat. Read the terse legal language of the house record, which communicated without sentiment that the bonding was formally dissolved under Provision 4 of the Lineage Continuity Law, and that the former bondmate was released from all house claim, protection, or recognition. Released, it was the word the database chose. Released like something that had been held and was now let go, which was one way to describe it. She could think of others. She closed the database entry and sat for a while. She thought about what you do when the law requires something of you that the law has no room for questioning. She thought about what you do with the consequence of having done it. She thought about a man she'd known named Ruiz who had laughed at all of his own jokes and carried an ancient VHS tape across 40 light years and whose hands were on the cassette casing she kept on her shelf, invisible but there. She thought about being the only warm thing on 42 square kilometers of dead rock, and how that changes what warmth means to you. She put the notebook away. She went to her workbench and started working on something she'd been thinking about for 3 weeks, a translation guide, a practical field manual for the most common tonal shifts in everyday Voikai communication, organized the way she organized everything, from components up. She worked on it for 6 hours without stopping. She was very good at working through things. The rival ship arrived at the beginning of her 5th month, with Kareth on the planet. She spotted it first. She was on the morning circuit, 3 kilometers out on the eastern flat, when she caught the drive signature cutting through the upper atmosphere. Wrong color, the Voikai used a pale blue-white burn on survey and research-class ships. This was something more violet, something colder. Military registry. She'd seen enough of that color during the waves to know it in her chest before she consciously identified it. She was back at base in just over 6 minutes. Kareth was already outside when she arrived. Standing at the edge of the flat, watching the sky, his dominant arm loose at his side but the hand half closed in the position she'd learned to recognize as readiness. Not drawn, not threatening, but available. His chitin was doing something she hadn't seen before, not the full deep indigo of authority, not the amber of attention or the gold orange whose name she still didn't know. Something between, something that had layers in it she couldn't quite read. "What is it?" she asked. He looked at her. He said a name, a house name, the designation of a bloodline. She'd encountered it in the linguistic database, in the sections on Voikai political structure, in the taxonomy of houses and their relationships to Kareth's own lineage. She knew the word. She'd just been waiting to see when he'd use it. Then he said a second thing. She understood most of it. She waited for Whale anyway. Whale had moved to her left shoulder, its habitual position, without being asked. Whale said, carefully, in the ascending tonal mode it used when it knew the content mattered. "He says they have come to take what he left here." Myra was quiet for a moment. "What did he leave here?" she asked. Whale's chassis tilted. She knew that tilt. It meant the drone was caught between 2 loyalties and choosing which way to fall. She'd learned that about Whale over 5 months. It was loyal to Kareth in the way a tool is loyal to the hand that built it. But it had built something toward her that didn't have a Voikai word for it. Something Whale had apparently developed on its own through 700 days of morning circuits and optical lens mobiles, and the sound of a woman talking to herself about gear housings while the flat turned red in the afternoon light. "It's all right," she said. "You don't have to." She looked at the sky, thought about what she knew, thought about what a rival house would come here to take, with military-class ships, from an apex of house conducting a survey commission on a dead colony world with a crew of 8. She said, "Tell me what I can do." The rival ship came down 3 kilometers north of base and deployed 12 soldiers in full kit. She counted them from the high point of the eastern relay station ruins, using the magnification system she'd assembled over 4 months from the optical debris in the salvage flats. 6 lenses arranged in a specific configuration that gave her roughly 11 times native magnification, which she'd verified by testing against distances she knew. 12 soldiers, full military kit, moving south-southeast in a loose column that said experienced rather than overconfident. She went back to base at a run. 12, she said to Kareth, armed full kit, moving south-southeast the eastern arc. They know the terrain layout, or they've got it mapped, because they're taking the route that keeps them in debris cover the longest. 40 minutes at their current pace before they reach the perimeter. He was looking at her differently than he usually did. She didn't have a name for the look yet. He said something to his crew. They moved instantly, efficiently, without any of the verbal choreography that human military units needed, because the Voikai communicated in harmonics that carried more information per second than spoken language, and his crew were 8 people who'd clearly prepared for contingencies and didn't need to be told twice. They broke into positions she watched quickly enough to understand the structure. 3 to the north perimeter, 2 to the western high ground, 2 to the south, 1 on the ship's defensive systems. 8 against 12. Outnumbered, but his crew were prepared and the terrain was had been his for 5 months, and she'd spent those 5 months making sure at least one of them knew every feature of it in detail. He was still looking at her. She said, "Give me 25 minutes." He said, "Why?" She said, "Because I've been building something and I haven't told you about it yet." She'd started working on the disruptors in the 7th week of her time with Kareth, when she'd understood enough of his equipment to recognize the frequency band of its targeting systems. That understanding had come from watching, from the scholars leaving their instruments unattended long enough for her to take readings she hadn't asked permission to take, from the same patient accumulation that was the only method she'd ever really had. She'd built them from components salvaged from the Eastern Relay Station array, components that had been sitting in her what I don't understand yet shelf, until she understood enough of the Volkai systems to realize she was looking at the raw material for something the survey database had a term for: signal disruption in the targeting frequency band, effective against military-class Volkai kit. She'd spent 7 weeks confirming her calculations as carefully as she could with the tools she had, and then building the units from components she'd accumulated specifically for this purpose over the preceding months, because she had learned that you build toward things before you know you need them, because the need always comes, and you are never ready for it unless you started before it arrived. She came back to where Kareth was standing with 2 devices the size of her forearm, each mounted on a small tripod she'd fabricated from relay station strut material. She set them down at his feet. He looked at them. She said, "These are signal disruptors. I built them from the relay array components you found in the eastern ruins, the ones the scholars cataloged in week 3. They operate in the frequency band of military-class Volkai targeting systems. If you place them here and here," she indicated positions on the ground with her foot, "they'll create a disruption corridor covering the south and east approaches. The rival soldiers' targeting will read as approximately 12 degrees off true in that corridor, enough to matter in a close engagement." She paused. "They'll affect your people's targeting too in the same zone, so you'll need to brief your crew on which sectors to avoid closing in, and your 3 on the northern perimeter will be outside the corridor and should be fine." She paused again. "I've been designing toward this for 2 months. I'm reasonably confident in the calculations." Reasonably. Kareth was looking at the disruptors, then at her. He said something she caught most of and waited for Whale to complete. "How long have you been building these?" "The components about 4 months. The final assembly 7 weeks, once I understood your targeting band." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She thought about it, then she said, "You hadn't asked me for help yet, and I wasn't sure you would, so I made sure I was ready either way." He said, "My people do not ask conquered species for assistance." "I know," she said. "You didn't ask, I offered." He said, "Why?" She thought about Ruiz's VHS tape, about the cockroaches, about Whale's first attempt at Mara, getting the shape of it even when the sounds were wrong, about a woman in an old musical holding a man's hand and singing about how the moment, held in memory, lasts a lifetime. She said, "Because you were worth helping, and because I've had a long time to think about what's worth doing with the time I have." She looked at him steadily. "And because if your rivals win this, I know what their policy is towards surviving members of conquered species. I read your database, so it's also practical, but mostly the first thing." His chitin bloomed, not amber, not indigo, the gold-orange color she'd seen before, the one whose name she didn't have yet, edge to edge, slow and complete, like something that had been waiting to happen. Whale, at her left shoulder, made the sound she had written in her notebook on the second week. This is what it sounds like when whale is moved. The fight lasted 9 minutes by her count. She stayed inside the shelter during the engagement, crouched behind the reinforced wall of the supply room, listening. She had no weapon, and she'd made a cold, strategic calculation that getting killed would help no one, and she was too valuable as an analyst, which was maybe arrogance and maybe just accurate, and she didn't spend much time on the distinction. She listened to the disruptors cycle twice in the pattern she designed. She listened to the shift in weapons fire that meant the disrupted targeting was compounding errors in the rival soldiers' coverage. She listened to the engagement shift, to the sound of it changing key the way a piece of music changes key, and she knew from the sound alone when it was over. She walked outside. 9 of the 12 rival soldiers were on the ground, their chitin dimmed to the flat gray-white of unconsciousness rather than death, which told her Kareth had been giving restraint orders because this was not a war he wanted to expand today. The other 3 were gone. She'd learn later they'd broken back to the ship and fled atmosphere before the engagement fully closed. Kareth's crew had 2 injured, neither critically. Kareth himself was unmarked. He was standing over one of the disruptors, studying it. She came and stood beside him. They stood there together for a moment, without either of them saying anything. He said, "How did you know the frequency?" "I watched the scholars' instruments in week 3, she said. "They left a calibration unit running unattended for 4 hours on the 3rd Tuesday. I took readings." He said, "You didn't have permission to take those readings." "No," she said, "but I didn't have a prohibition against it either, and I needed to know." He was quiet. Then, "You have been building toward a threat you had no certainty would materialize." "I had reasonable certainty," she said. "You're the apex of house conducting a survey commission on a world that's useless to everyone except you, with a crew too small for combat and too specialized for standard survey work. Something brought you here that your people don't know about and that your rivals can use against you. I didn't need to know the specifics to know the shape of it." He looked at her for a long time. He said something she caught entirely, in the full Voakai register without simplification, the first time he'd spoken to her without the careful speaker-to-learner adjustment. "You are the least predictable datum this survey has produced." She said, "I don't know if that's a compliment." He said, "It is not a category I have previously used for compliment, but in this case it functions as one." She almost smiled. She held it to a small thing. "All right," she said, "let's get your injured crew inside." The rival house sent a diplomatic communique 6 days later. It arrived through the standard Voakai channels, addressed to the apex of house, acknowledging his survey commission and the legal defense of his survey site. It did not mention the 12 soldiers. It did not reference the engagement or its outcome. The communique was a retreat so carefully worded that it managed to be a retreat without acknowledging it had ever advanced. She read it over Kareth's shoulder. She'd gotten comfortable enough for that, and he'd stopped registering it as presumptuous. And she noted the specific language around the survey site and its resources. She said, "They're calling me a survey resource." He said, "Yes." She said, "What does that mean in Voakai law?" He said, "A resource under the Commission's protection cannot be claimed, extracted, or harmed by any house without the Commission holder's consent." She said, "And if the Commission holder is you?" He said, "Then no house may touch you without my agreement, including mine." She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "What does that mean about the exile?" He was quiet. She said, "The woman you sent away, Evith, she's with your rivals now, she's why they came." He was still quiet. She said, "They're using her. Whatever she knows, whatever she gave them when they took her in, she's the reason they knew where you were and what your commission was actually about." She wasn't sure how much of this was accurate and how much was inference, but she said it at the rate she was certain of it. "That's a hard thing to have done." He said, "Yes." She said, I'm not going to help you fix that. Whatever broke between you and her, that's between you and her, and whatever your law says about repairing something like that. I'm not a substitute for it. I'm not here to fill the shape she left. She looked at him directly. I'm here because I survived when I wasn't supposed to, and I've been building things from the ruins of everything I had. And if that turns out to be useful to you, it's a coincidence we can both work with. But I need you to understand what I am and what I'm not. He said, I understand the distinction. She said, do you? He said, you are the first being in 3 decades of command who has helped me without being required to. The distinction is apparent. She nodded once. She went back to her work table. He stood there for a long moment, watching her settle into the work. His chitin held the gold-orange color for a long time after she stopped looking. What came next took months, then years, then more than that. She learned his language completely, not the simplified register, not the careful exchange of a teacher with a student, but the real language, all its harmonics and subfrequencies and the specific tonal shadings that carried meaning no word could carry alone. She learned it the way she'd learned everything, by building from components, never assuming she understood until she could demonstrate it, going back and correcting when she found her mistakes. She made many mistakes. He corrected them without contempt, which she came to understand was not his default posture toward error, and was therefore something she should notice and did. She learned the Vaukai history of the war. Not the version she'd grown up understanding, which was the human account, the record of waves and losses and what had been taken. The Vaukai version, the specific miscalculation that had started it, a human diplomatic mission 20 years before the first wave, encountering Vaukai border markers and reading their warning emission system as equipment malfunction rather than communication. The escalation chain, junction by junction. The way the Vaukai High Command had interpreted the human expansion pattern as an existential threat to bloodlines they defended for 11 generations. None of it made the deaths right. Understanding why something happened is not the same as forgiving it. She held both of those things simultaneously without difficulty, because she'd had a long time to practice holding difficult things. She told him, understanding the reason for a thing doesn't make the thing right. He said, no, but it makes the next thing possible. She said, what next thing? He said, my people will stop the campaign. We always stop. The question is not whether we stop but what we do after. We don't know how to go back. She said, no species does. He said, yours tried. She said, we didn't get the chance. He said, nothing. She said, but if we did, if there are enough of us left somewhere to try, and I think there might be, Kareth, I think the survey data you're not showing me might say there are, I think that's part of why you came here, would your people allow it? A pause, the specific quality of it. He said, I would make it possible, if there were enough of your people left to try. She said, is that a promise or a direction? He said, it is a direction given by the only person in this system who has the authority to give it. She looked at him for a long time. She reached over and took the VHS tape from the shelf, held it, the plastic casing, the woman's face, Ruiz's fingerprints invisible on it but present, always present, the weight of someone who had been and was now gone. She put it back. She said, I have a lot of work to do. He said, so do I. She said, then we'd better start. She sent the signal 11 months later, from the reconstructed dish array that Kareth's engineers had helped her rebuild on the site of the old post. The coordinates Kareth gave her were not on any human chart she'd ever seen, which told her they were in a zone the Vaukai had surveyed and she hadn't, which told her other things too. The signal said, this is Mara Voss, Colonial Survey Authority Field Technician, Grade 4, Registration 7741E. I am alive on Kepler's 3rd. I have information. I have assistance. If there are others, respond to this frequency. If you're afraid to respond on this frequency, respond on the backup I'm encoding in the carrier signal. If you're afraid to respond at all, I understand. But try. She sat on the flat and waited, the way she'd learned to wait, which was by working on something else. The answer came back in 19 days. It was a small signal, compressed, cautious, from coordinates she couldn't identify on any chart she had. It said, "We are here. We don't know what you mean by assistance. We're afraid of what assistance looks like. How many of you are there?" She wrote back, "Right now one, but I'm working on it." The long work is another story. The conclave of houses she addressed in Kareth's language without a translator, the first human ever to stand in that hall, which went badly for the first hour, and then shifted in a way she still couldn't fully account for, and ended with the first formal acknowledgement, in 11 years of war, that the human species had a claim on something beyond cessation of hostilities. The night she found the entry in the Vaukai database for Earth, all the metrics, the resource assessments, the cold intelligence gathering that had preceded the first wave, written in the language she'd learned in the ruins of everything those words had led to. What that felt like. The argument she had with Kareth, the one real argument about Evith, because she was not going to pretend it hadn't happened, that a woman hadn't been defined as nothing for a failure that was not a failure, that a law which did that was a law and nothing more. The argument lasted 3 days and ended not with resolution, but with an acknowledgement between them that some things needed time that they didn't have yet, and that time was something they were building together, one piece at a time. What she thought about in the years after, when she was trying to explain to people how any of it had started, how a Dead World Survey Commission became a negotiation, how a negotiation became an agreement, how an agreement became the slow and grinding work of putting 2 species back into the same galaxy without one of them finishing what it had started, was always the same moment. The flat, the morning circuit, a drone hovering 80 meters away with a weapon port aimed at her chest and no particular reason not to use it. And herself standing there with her hand raised. Not because she had a plan, not because she had a strategy, not because 700 days of survival had given her a theory of how to end a war. Just because she was human, and humans reach toward things, even things that might kill them, and that reaching, stubborn, irrational, completely and persistently unkillable, was the one trait the Vaukai had never surveyed for and never weighted in any calculation. Whale had been with her for every day of what came after. She'd asked Kareth once, when she was sure enough of her Vaukai to trust the question's nuance, whether Whale was capable of something like preference. He'd been quiet for a long time before he said, "Whale was designed to search for biological survival. It found the last one in this system. It appears to have decided that its directive is complete as long as that survival continues." She'd looked at the drone, hovering at her left shoulder in its habitual position. She said, "That's a very generous reading of a directive." Whale made the sound she'd first heard on the second day, the tonal inquiry, ascending at the end. She reached up and put her hand flat against the drone's chassis, the way she'd pressed her hand to her own chest on that first morning. "Mara." Whale held still. Its scan array went quiet. The whole hum of its drive system dropped below her hearing. She said, "Yeah, me too." She picked up a piece of scrap from the nearest debris pile, turned it in her hands, felt the weight of it, the possibility of it, all the things it could become if you paid enough attention and weren't afraid of starting over when the first design was wrong. She started walking. Whale moved alongside her, 3 meters to the left, its habitual companion distance, the same distance it had maintained since the 4th week, never explained, apparently non-negotiable in whatever logic governed the drone's behavior. She had long since stopped questioning it. She'd thought about it once, sitting in the shelter during a long, flat storm, and decided that Whale's programming had told it to find biological survival and stay close to it. And Whale had done exactly that with a literalness that was either very simple or very profound, and she didn't think the distinction mattered as much as people who hadn't spent 700 days alone would probably argue. She thought about the woman in the VHS musical, holding someone's hand and singing about the moment that lasts. She thought about Ruiz, who had thought it was funny to carry that tape across 40 light years and had never gotten to explain the joke to her properly. She thought about Doakai sitting cross-legged on the flat for hours, reading her notebooks with the hunger of someone who has found a shelf they didn't know was theirs. She thought about 9 rival soldiers lying unconscious on the flat instead of dead, because Kareth had given restraint orders in a fight he could have won harder, because he was already thinking about the next thing, the thing after the thing, in the way that people think when they've started to believe there's a next thing worth thinking about. She thought about what it means to have work. Not task, not assignment. Work, the thing you do because it is what you are, because it is what you reach toward, because the reaching itself is the point and not the destination. She had been a field technician, 4th grade. She had been a survivor. She had been a salvager, a builder, a linguist source material, a signal disruptor. She had been the first human to stand before a Volkai conclave and speak their language in their hall, and she had not been afraid, or had been afraid precisely, in the way you are afraid of falling from a height you chose to climb to, where the fear is part of the choosing and you'd be worried if it wasn't there. She did not know what she was becoming. She did not need to know. She needed to keep working, one component at a time, and trust that the structure would become visible as it was built. She had work to do. She always had work to do. It was, she had come to understand, the most human thing about her. Not the stubbornness, not the ingenuity, not the willingness to reach towards something that might kill you. Those were all real. But underneath all of them was this: the belief, stubborn, irrational, persistent, unkillable, that the thing in your hands could become something better than it was. That the ruins around you were not an ending but a material. That whatever had been lost was not gone but changed in form. And that the work of being human was to find that form and give it shape. The Volkai scholars who wrote the history of how the war ended used a word from their own tradition that translated as, "The moment a thing begins to know itself by what it cannot consume." The human translator who worked on that document read the phrase several times. She wrote in her annotation, "Yes, that exactly." Her name was Mara Voss. She had work to do.